I'm amazed that people aren't constantly talking about their dreams. Because the fact that we dream is one of the strangest and most perplexing facts about human psychology. We go to these completely different worlds which often function in a manner utterly at variance with the real world, filled with fantastical imagery, populated by autonomous beings who seem to have their own thoughts and behaviors, sometimes encounter things which are truly supernatural, and yet we seem more likely to have conversations about politics or the stock market. The main reason for this seems to be the fact that dreams are really hard to remember. And so most people aren't mesmerized by their dreams because the memory for them seems to fade away very rapidly. And yet if people paid attention to their dreams with greater effort, they might discover insights of a truly transcendental nature. This is why I recommend to everybody that you keep a dream journal and record your dreams in this journal just after you wake up, so that your memory of the dream is still relatively fresh. What's really interesting is that the more you try to remember the fragments of your dream, the more those fragments might remind you of other things which happened in the dream, allowing you to build a coherent notion of what actually occurred. Now, having recorded my dreams for about 7 years now, I can say that my dreams have taught me a lot, both about my own mind and about the world in general. I've seen some indescribably beautiful scenes in my dreams, as well as horrors beyond reckoning. And in this video, I will share some of the things I've witnessed, as well as what I've learned. And if you're interested in doing dream analysis with me, or just therapy in general, check out the link in the description to set up a free phone consultation with me, or just reach out by email and we can probably get something set up. So if we think back to the fact that dreams are so hard to remember, the most likely reason for this seems to be that when you sleep, your ego complex breaks down. Your ego is your sense of I-ness, or your sense of self, and it filters the contents of your conscious mind, paying attention to some things while filtering other experiences out. Your ego selects what it wants to hold on to in short-term memory, and by doing so, these memories may eventually be stored in long-term memory. It's almost like your conscious mind is creating some kind of narrative, and that narrative being stored in your long-term memory is your memory of that event. Without an ego, this function seems almost impossible. And so you can't easily remember what happened in your dreams because you lack an ego to be able to hold on to short-term memories. The absence of an ego also results in dreams sometimes being far more emotionally intense and expressive than you would normally be during your waking life. This is because the ego filters for emotions as well. It is responsible for pushing away difficult emotions which you don't want to feel and repressing them into your unconscious mind. And so when your ego is gone, these emotions can easily flood back into your psyche. This implies that dreams may serve the function of regulating and expressing emotions which your ego ordinarily neglects. This often happens to me when I experience dreams about friends who I haven't seen in a while. I often find myself crying rather intensely in my dreams because it dawns on me how much I actually miss these friends. And while I do miss these friends right now, I don't really feel like crying about it until, that is, my ego is no longer able to hold back my emotions. And in my dreams, I have a chance to experience just how deep those emotions really are. But there are other consequences of lacking an ego in a dream, because your ego is responsible for checking if the world conforms to your prior rational beliefs, i.e., it's responsible for rationality. Rationality simply means consistent with one's prior assumptions. And your ego applies rationality to the world as your way of making sense of the world and understanding things like causal connections. Without this function in a dream, rationality goes completely out the window, and it becomes possible for things that are completely irrational and illogical to take place in your dreams. And without an ego, you rarely ever question the absurdity of these situations. You just go along with it as though it all makes sense. For example, my dog Lucky passed away in 2020, and some of you might know my dog Teddy, who looks pretty similar, just with different colors. I once had a dream that Lucky had actually survived his death, and the vets decided to keep him until my sister randomly found him there. She brought Lucky home, and Lucky and Teddy were acting like brothers. Honestly, a sweet thing to see. But if my logical, rational ego was present during the dream, I would know that this makes no sense at all, because Lucky passed away and I saw it happen. But in the dream, I accepted the fact that he was there, like it made perfect sense. And so dreams will often present us with situations which we logically know don't make any sense, but because we lack an ego to be able to apply logic, we just accept things as they are presented to us. Like, yeah, of course there's a giant octopus attacking this city. Why would it be otherwise? But this isn't to say that dreams can't access memories at all. In fact, it seems that our unconscious minds are able to reach really far back into the past in order to remind us of things which our conscious mind has all but forgotten. It will often happen to me that I'll dream about somebody who I haven't seen or thought about in years, and I'm suddenly reminded of their existence thanks to the dream. And it almost seems like dreams have their own memory bank and their own capacity to form memories independently of the ego. A great and genuinely perplexing demonstration of this fact happened to me when I dreamed that I was back in high school and this drug dealer was trying to convince me to help him smuggle drugs into the school. He said that in 2 weeks he would bring the drugs and I would need to help him unload them and bring them into the school. I was intimidated by this guy, so I agreed, and the dream basically just ended there. But then 2 weeks later, 2 weeks in real life, I had a dream where I was at high school and then this drug dealer asked me, "Are you ready to go?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" Until I remembered the dream which I had 2 weeks prior of me agreeing to smuggle drugs into the school. At which point I played my pre-agreed role and brought the boxes into the school. I found this really strange, and it isn't even the first time when events in one dream seem to continue weeks or even months later in a different dream. Another thing which is apparent from dreams is that the unconscious is very creative, and is in fact a wellspring of creativity from which all human endeavors to be creative originate. It is as though being unrestricted by the ego allows your mind to experiment with ideas, creating things which you ordinarily would never envision. For example, I once had a dream where I was breaking into somebody's house, but then I tripped an alarm and the police immediately rushed to the scene. And instead of police dogs, they were accompanied by police chimpanzees on leashes and wearing body armor. This scared the crap out of me. I find chimpanzees to be some of the scariest animals, so I immediately complied with the police. But just think about that for a second. Police chimpanzees, like what a random idea for my mind to just spontaneously generate. Dreams often play around with the ideas which we've absorbed consciously to try and generate new insights from them, or to use what we've experienced consciously as symbols pointing to a different meaning. There was a time in my life when I was really interested in particle physics, and I even worked on my own models of exotic particles. And in the midst of this, I remember having this dream. I was a scientist, and I kept hearing explosions until it dawned on me that someone was misusing my invention. I raced back to my lab, followed by my colleagues, but as I approached, I sensed some kind of trap. I go inside anyways, and a group of people are splitting these interesting particles which I either invented or discovered. And every time a particle was split, an alternative future or past played on this screen. I walk in just as they are splitting a particle, and on the screen, a different version of a scene from Breaking Bad plays. But it's extremely violent for some reason, and it shows Walt killing a bunch of people with a knife before turning the knife on himself and mutilating himself. More happened later in the dream. In fact, I'm not sure I should have mentioned the whole Breaking Bad thing given how violent it was. But the point I'm trying to make is that whatever you absorb consciously can end up in the unconscious, where it is reworked into a symbol in order to express a creative idea. In this case, the idea of splitting particles and that somehow creating alternate realities. And these images can be really perplexing at times, and the meaning can be rather unclear. Which makes sense because the unconscious is trying to express something which isn't easily understood by our conscious minds. Take for example this dream I had. I walked into this elevator, but instead of going up or down, it went forward through time. And it zoomed all the way to the end of time before restarting at the beginning of time and zooming all the way to the end of time again, repeating over and over in this endless loop, which felt like it happened 100 times. I was stuck in this elevator with 3 other people, when suddenly this woman appears. And when I ask who she is, she starts painting her face green with her fingers. This is where the dream ended, but you can see that something very profound is being expressed by this dream. And yet it isn't always clear what the accurate interpretation is. Almost like it's some art house film made by a pretentious, likely traumatized director, and it takes work to understand the deeper meaning of what's going on. But sometimes the message is much more clear because the dream is expressing in symbolic format something which you consciously contemplate. Almost like it's painting your thoughts from a different perspective. For example, something which is always on my mind is the conflict between man and nature. and how we often underestimate nature's ability to push back against the systems of order which we have created and overwhelm them. And this dream seems to be a reflection of these thoughts. An enormous feminine titan or goddess, who I intuitively understood to be the Earth Mother, arose out of the ocean, followed by this army of spectral animals such as deer and whales. And followed by this ghostly army, she attacked this walled city where I was in. And it caused the walls of the city to collapse, and people were panicking, and it was just general chaos. But you can see the connection between what I've thought about consciously and these dream images. I've noticed as well that there are often very different types of dreams. Most of my dreams are either really brief, or they're so disjointed that it's hard to see how events follow logically from one another. And they jump around with very little continuity. But every once in a while, I have a dream with a striking level of continuity from start to finish, as though I'm watching a 2-hour movie with a proper, coherent narrative structure. And these dreams never fail to shock me, especially in contrast to my typical dreams. One of these dreams involved a childhood friend of mine and his girlfriend, who were close to getting married until they discovered that she had this rare, incurable disease. And this narrative continued for a really long time until the girl's tragic death. Almost like this really heart-wrenching but beautiful movie. And that's how I felt after I woke up. I was really surprised that the same narrative continued for so long in a single dream. Another aspect of dreams which is really interesting are the presence of other people who seem autonomous and who can talk to you. And I've had experiences where the people in my dream would say things which were so perplexing and completely contrary to the sort of things I would normally say. This happened once in a rather long dream of mine, which I'll condense and explain here. But before I do so, I should just mention that I've noticed that a lot of things can influence the kind of dreams that you have. For example, if you're sick with a fever, expect fever dreams, which are even more unusual than normal. This particular dream, which I'm going to mention, happened when I fell asleep really drunk. And whenever I do so, my dreams tend to be more strange, more vivid, and more lucid sometimes. But here's the dream. I was somebody who worked with kids with disability in some kind of a facility which mirrored a log cabin. But to get there, I had to trek through this massive blizzard with several other people towing sleds. When I get there, a very young girl with really pale skin and a really oddly distorted face asks me whether I'm one of the people from beyond, and I answer yes. Before I go on, I should just mention that I actually recently saw this girl again in one of my dreams, which was really surprising because it's actually been a while since I had this dream. But later in the dream, another kid, this time a boy of maybe 8 years old, who was rather chubby, and who also had this really strange distorted face, asks me my name and then tells me that we're going to be best friends. I ask him for his name, and instead of telling me, he just refers to himself as Steve Parker's son and then points to his dad. I found this kind of funny, and I ask him again for his name, but he wouldn't tell me, so I just say that I'm going to give him a nickname. And then he called me American, which meant that everything I do or believe was driven by consensus. And I laughed at this because I found it hilarious and unexpected. But as I laughed, the boy became clearly uncomfortable. He started crying, and his dad came and comforted him and took him away. Then another worker turned to me and told me that the kid wanted the interaction to end very desperately. There are several fascinating things about how the characters in this dream behaved. Especially the kid, because when I ask him his name, he just refers to himself as somebody else's son. This means that whatever this kid represents in my unconscious, the concept of having a name or an independent identity is completely foreign to it. And it just thinks of itself in relation to someone else, in this case his father. That was really bizarre and unexpected to me. And when he called me American, which I'm not by the way, unless he meant North American, something about him saying that Americans are driven by consensus is like weirdly true, but at the same time it's not a thought that I would ordinarily have, or at least I wouldn't put it in that way. It's like my unconscious delivered this insight to me through the dream boy. And also the fact that he became uncomfortable when I laughed was really strange to me, because it's almost the opposite of how I typically expect people to react when I laugh. I laugh a lot, and rather easily, and I do so to be positive and joyous. And most of the time this works, which is why him becoming uncomfortable seems to point to a mentality that's really different from my own. And lastly, the guy who told me that the kid desperately wanted the interaction to end, which was honestly really upsetting, felt like he was being blunt in a manner which I'm ordinarily not. The main takeaway is that the people in your dreams can be really different from how you are consciously, and express a side of your personality which is utterly at variance with your ego. Now, I actually regarded that dream with the kid as being really dark. It was a really messed up scene, and like the kids' faces were super weird. And what better way to segue into the nightmarish stuff which I've witnessed in my dreams? I've noticed that these nightmares seem to occur when I'm not doing so well in life as to kind of depict the situation in my life, but from the dream perspective. But they also sometimes occur when everything is seemingly fine, as though to warn me of what potentially could happen. But I have witnessed things which honestly felt like poison to the soul. Unimaginable horrors which made me wonder why the unconscious was torturing me with these visions. In fact, some were so strange and incomprehensible that I can't really even describe them apart from saying that it felt like demons were infiltrating my mind. But here are some of the ones I can describe. One began when I was at a house party with quite a few guests, and the guests would keep getting into fights with each other, punching and wrestling, but each fight ended in exactly the same way, where they would both run up to some kitchen appliance like the stove and light themselves on fire. They would violently burn up, and wherever the ashes of their body were, puddles would start to appear. And the most disturbing part about this is that it would just happen over and over again. It felt like it must have happened like 200 times, and it just wouldn't stop. I was desperately running up to people to try to get them to stop fighting, but it wouldn't work. They would fight, light themselves on fire, and then create these puddles. Finally, I snapped, and I realized that God was responsible for all of this because he created the world in which it was happening. I was filled with anger for God, but then I heard his voice say, "How am I responsible for this?" And that made me think of the devil, and at this point I started to sort of realize that I was dreaming. And then I asked, why am I possessed? Because it felt like demons inside of me were causing this to happen. Then suddenly I was in bed with this girl, and she raised her hands upwards, and I started floating upwards towards this painting of Mother Mary on the ceiling. So that was weird, and it really calls into question how it is that the mind can produce those sorts of images. But if you're familiar with archetypal imagery, you might be able to piece together some of the archetypal components of that dream. In fact, feel free to do so in the comments with that dream or any other dream which I've explained in this video. Now here's another dream which was rather nightmarish. This was a really long dream that just wouldn't end, where I was in a church for a while and I had this really eerie feeling that something wasn't right. And so I put on my glasses, and these glasses revealed that all around me, this church was infested by demons. There were demons everywhere. They were very large, twisted, malformed beings of pure darkness and evil. And they evoked immense fear and horror in me. And they were defiling the church until Satan himself fell from the rafters and joined the other demons. I was desperately searching for an exit anywhere in this church until I came to the center of the church. And in the center of the church, there was this demonic relic, and I can't remember at all what it looked like. But when I looked at it, I instinctively knew that this was the most evil object that I have ever witnessed. And the indescribable terror from that finally woke me up. And that was a horrifying thing to experience. Now, the demonic imagery in this dream also has an archetypal significance. And even this dream is not so hard to interpret, or at least, give a loose interpretation for, if you're familiar with archetypal imagery and mythology. And especially if you think about that object in the center and the fact that I can't really even tell you what it looked like, only that it radiated pure evil. But nevertheless, I've learned that the mind is capable of conjuring up true horrors if it wants to. And these nightmares might make it seem like I only ever experience bad things in my dreams, but this is far from true. In fact, to the exact same extent that I've witnessed ugly things in my dreams, I've also witnessed beautiful dreams. These radiant, peaceful settings with beautiful colors and lights. For example, I once climbed to the summit of this mountain, and when I looked down into the mountain's secret valley, I saw an extraordinarily beautiful sight. Beautiful flowers of many different colors as far as the eye could see, pristine lakes shimmering in the sunlight, and hundreds of animals of all types and forms: gazelles, giraffes, zebras, elephants, bears, lions, tigers, and many more existing peacefully in this paradise, where it felt like spring lasted eternally and the moon hovered overhead much closer than it normally is. It was honestly breathtaking. It often happens that my dreams will craft a painting of the highest quality, and I will be awestruck by the beauty which my mind generates. especially given that I'm not a great visual artist and my ability to conjure mental imagery using my mind's eye is actually pretty weak. In some dreams, I'll be at the beach and it'll be so serene and calming. And there are hundreds of fish and whales and other marine life leaping out of the water. And I've also had many dreams which felt like this warm hug from a divine, love-filled entity that made me wake up feeling so warm and positive. These dreams sometimes have many of my dear friends and family members all bonding together, and these often serve to remind me of the people I have in my life. I've had other dreams where I was a member of this very close, tight-knit community, and the way the community functions so harmoniously and how everybody cared for everybody else really lifts my spirits. So far, I've only referenced the concept of lucid dreaming a few times, but in the past, I used to experience a huge number of lucid dreams. Less so these days for whatever reason, but I used to be able to experience lucid dreams whenever I wanted, simply by waking up a couple of hours early and then going back to sleep on my back. If you don't know, a lucid dream is when, for some reason, your ego suddenly reappears while you're in the dream, and you suddenly become aware of the fact that you are in a dream. It's a really cool experience because now you're in this world which completely defies logic, but you can interact with it with much more intention. Whereas before, you just kind of rolled with whatever situation was playing out. And my lucid dreams have taught me a lot, while also giving me a lot of mysteries to ponder. The first thing is that when you get the hang of being in the dream space, you can really take control of things and do whatever you want. I often fly around in these dream worlds at extraordinary speeds, and I can even give myself superpowers. Like one time I remember summoning a lightning bolt and throwing it at a truck and it exploded. I can even force other people to appear, like celebrities or fictional characters, and interact with them. Being in this space really makes you realize just how vast and expansive it actually is. I would be flying over cities for seemingly hours without end. And one time I even looked up and saw these beautiful blue planets which were really close to the Earth, and I tried flying straight towards them, although I didn't make it. And becoming lucid in a dream gives you the chance to really experience the mesmerizing things which often happen in dreams. It gives you a good chance to talk to the people in your dreams, but also it's easier to take in the beauty which the dream often presents. I remember one time seeing these astonishingly bright lights, almost brighter than the sun, but I could look at them and obviously there was no eye damage. And you can enjoy this beautiful scenery much more because you're conscious of it. I've had so many fascinating lucid dream experiences where I would experiment with the people in my dreams to see what kind of things they would say. And I've even tried things like jumping off buildings to see if dying in a dream actually wakes you up, like Inception. Which it can do, but it's also possible that the dream will just keep going. But in my experience, lucid dreaming is actually very energetically taxing. And I almost always wake up feeling really drained and exhausted. And the reason for this is because your consciousness is supposed to be resting when you're asleep, thus making lucid dreams defeat one of the purposes of sleeping. I've also had many experiences which I think were astral projection experiences, where basically I could feel that I was sleeping, but when I tried to get up, it's almost like my spirit got up and then my body was still there, so I could look down at my body and see myself sleeping. This happened to me a couple of times, and having experimented with this space, I've been led to believe, although I could be wrong, that astral projection is really just a different kind of lucid dreaming. And this has led me to believe, although I could be wrong, that when you experience astral projection, you aren't actually leaving your body. Instead, it's actually just another kind of lucid dream. The reason I conclude this is because, for example, I would wake up in my house and my room would seem fine, like the furniture would be arranged as it is normally, but as I explored more and more of my house, I would realize that things were in different places, the furniture was set up in a different way, which leads me to think that there was no way I was actually walking around my house as like this ethereal spirit. Instead, all of that just happened in my mind, but it's still interesting because it shows that your mind is capable of generating a map of your environment, which can be fairly accurate. So while it's really trippy to just step outside of your body, I don't think you're actually leaving your body. Again, I could be wrong. But getting back to lucid dreams, the most astonishing thing, or at least one of the most astonishing things which I've experienced in the midst of all of this, is this basic experiment I perform every time I remember to do so, which is simply to look very intently at an object in the dream world, like a leaf off of a tree, for example, just to examine how detailed it actually is. And I swear to you, every single time I've done this, I would look at this object and realize and be awestruck by this realization that it's just as detailed and just as photorealistic as it is in the real world. Dreams can often feel foggy and disjointed, leading to this perception that they look less real than reality. But if you become lucid in a dream, try just staring at something to see how it compares to real life. Because every time I do this, I'm hit with this sense of utter astonishment when I realize that this object is indistinguishable from how it would look in real life. Not just particular objects, but the entire setting as well. I would just stare into the distance and look at, the sun or cars passing by and realize that they look just like real cars and the real sun. Now think about this for a minute. When you look at something in real life, photons bounce off of that object and enter your eye, and that information gets processed in the back of your brain over here to produce the image which you're experiencing. But the image is still fundamentally in your head, it's just being generated by an external experience. But lucid dreams seem to suggest that your brain is capable of generating entirely photorealistic objects without the external input needed to generate those objects. It can recreate the same level of detail entirely internally. That always blows my mind, and it's one of the coolest things which I've learned from lucid dreams. So hopefully you found this discussion interesting, and hopefully it has convinced you to keep a dream journal. Because huge amounts of fantastical imagery, which can be very symbolically and psychologically enriching, is just being thrown in the garbage if you don't take the time to record your dreams. And if you do start recording your dreams, consider working with me to analyze and interpret the dreams in order to pick apart the deeper symbolic meaning which is being expressed. If you're interested in that, click on the description to find my booking page, or just send me an email so we can get started talking. But yeah, anyways, that's all I have to say. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.